and I think this is where Matthew is probably historically accurate. He recognized that Jesus saw himself as being sent only to Israel. But Matthew's church is a combined church of Jews and Gentiles. And so he has to believe that somehow Jesus's will was to include the Gentiles into Israel. And I don't mean that he wanted the church to be Gentile. He wanted the Gentiles to become Israel. That's why Matthew never says, unlike Paul would say, or Luke would say, or other New Testament writers would say, that Gentiles don't have to keep the law. Matthew insisted that everyone in his church keep the law.
Yeah, the Gentiles included.
The Gentiles
have to follow the Sabbath laws, the kosher food laws, and the males be circumcised. Gentiles.
Exactly. There's not one hint in any of the Gospel of Matthew that he believed that Gentile believers didn't have to keep the entire Torah, however he understood it. Now, of course, in Matthew's day, there were lots of ways of interpreting the Torah. So, for example, some people said, you couldn't rub your hands together with grain on the Sabbath. That's breaking the Sabbath. Well, Matthew doesn't believe that. Some people say you have to wash your hands before you eat or handle. Matthew doesn't believe that. So he said he has Jesus' disciples not washing their hands. And Jesus calls that, that's just the tradition of your elders. But nowhere does Jesus in Matthew say, Moses said to you, and I'm throwing it out. And in fact, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, Moses says to you, do not commit adultery. I say to you, do not even look at a woman with the intention of committing adultery. Notice, Jesus is not throwing away the anti-adultery commandment. He's making it harder to keep.
So it's intensifying it. It's making it more difficult in a way because
exactly.
the law intensely personal into the heart rather than just mere external obedience.
In Matthew, Jesus internalizes the Mosaic law and puts it inside the human being, which makes it even harder to keep.
Right.
You might say, don't kill. Well, Jesus says in Matthew, don't even be angry. What do you mean, don't be angry? How can you not be angry? Jesus intensifies the Torah in Matthew. This is totally different from Luke and Acts and Paul. Totally different. So Matthew has a Jesus who's completely Jewish, completely Torah observant. And yet at the very end, he says, go get the Gentiles and bring them in. But notice he doesn't say they get to stay Gentiles. They have to keep the law also. Now, he doesn't say they have to become Jews. So that's a difference. But I don't know what he would call them. He doesn't call them Jews. But he doesn't call them Gentiles. If you look at the word Gentile in Matthew, Matthew never uses the word Gentile for people in his own community. Mm-hmm. Gentiles are out there. So Matthew has this weird view that Jesus opened up the church to the nations, but he didn't really open it up to Gentiles, did he? Because they have to keep the law also.
But this is why what you're saying is so shocking, really, to the uninitiated. You write on page 99, most Christians have been taught traditionally and at one time or another that Christianity represents the supersession, the superseding of Judaism. The thing that makes Jews and Christians alike is their worship of the same God. What separates them is that Christians need not follow Jewish law. It surprises people when they come to realize, as modern scholars have done, that this is not at all the attitude to the law in Matthew. And then you go on, which I won't read, to quote Matthew 5:17 to 20. And you also later on quote Matthew 23, verses 1 to 4, which also kind of reinforce the same point. This is really shocking because it's a kind of Christianity, or a kind of Jewish Christianity, which we're just not familiar with today. There is no such, and Paul himself, who predates the writing of Matthew, arguably would intensely disagree with that as well.
Absolutely. And that's why I find Matthew so amazing. I imagine, I don't know this because we can't know this, but I imagine Matthew being a gospel that was written for a community living somewhere in Syria, which would have been a very Semitic place.
True.
Arabic, Jewish, strong Jewish community. That's one of the birthplaces of later rabbinic Judaism. And his church is a law observant. This is so ironic. It's a law observant mixed church. This is the one of the parables in Matthew that's not in any place else are the parables about the mixture. There's the weeds and the wheat. And how do you keep apart the weeds and the wheat? Well, you can't. You just have to wait for Jesus to come. And then he'll separate the weeds and the wheat. And I think that's the way he saw his church, is a mixture of Jews and Gentiles that he couldn't separate out. But he wanted the Gentiles to be law observant. And I believe it's because he just thought Jesus never foresaw that there would be a law-free form of the Jesus movement.
So how would the author of Matthew, whoever he was, have viewed Paul's gospel, which on what I'm reading is particularly a Lutheran reading, is a law-free gospel, that it completely rejects the law as something completely inappropriate. And even Justin Martyr, not just Ignatius of Antioch, I should say, the turn of the first century, he said, don't follow Judaism. You're not Jews, you're Christians. Don't follow this religion. This is a really, so how would Matthew would have viewed Paul as an imposter, an apostate, a ne'er-do-well, not a real authentic follower of Jesus, I guess, if that message was
we know for a fact from other sources there were a whole lot of Christians who thought Paul was crazy and wrong and heretical, and this is not news that Paul was seen as heretical, but it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? The real revolution was in people who came along like Paul and like Luke and said, this whole thing about the Torah, that was fine for a time, but it's gone. It's over. They were the ones who were the revolutionaries. Matthew did what we should have expected people to do.